Genesis chapter 37 is where we're at. 37 tonight. How many of you guys come from a dysfunctional family? You know, it's funny because in our society, in our day and age, that's like the thing, right? Well, I come from a really dysfunctional family. As if that's the excuse for why we're so dysfunctional ourselves, or why we're a jerk, or why whatever in our lives is messed up, and we blame it on that. And yet tonight we're going to be looking at a young man who, in spite of dysfunction, in spite of everything going the wrong way, would end up becoming just an exceptional and godly person. And you know, just in the sense, you know, thinking about it, you know, Joseph, one of the two men in the Old Testament that gives us, you know, any type of a narrative about their life, that the Bible has nothing bad to say about them. You know, it never says that they sinned, never said that they did anything. And the other one would be Daniel. You know, two guys with lengthy narratives, and the Bible never speaks of one mistake that they made. You know, not that they were perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it just goes to prove that here's a kid who grows up in a very, very dysfunctional family, if you could ever call one dysfunctional, and ends up honoring the Lord, even when everything seems to be going sideways in his life. And you remember that, you know, all the things, we've been talking about Jacob, Israel, and, you know, all that, but you have to remember that little Joseph was there when Rachel and Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah and the whole family, Jacob took them out of their uncle Laban's house and drove them fast across the desert, trying to head back to the land of Canaan, and Laban in hot pursuit. You know, and so you can imagine how stressful that was on a little guy. You know, Uncle Laban's coming, we got to hurry, you know, and just that whole drama, and then leaving Laban behind, and then it's like, oh no, Uncle Esau's coming, and, you know, they're dividing everybody into camps, and okay, you guys go over the other side of the river, and you can imagine, you know, I can just see poor little Joseph going off, you know, just a little guy at the time, crying as his mom's hurrying, and come on, we got to hurry, you know, just sensing the stress of the whole situation. And then, of course, they settle a couple of times, one in Sukkoth and then over in Shechem. And then in Shechem, things go sideways. And he's probably, you know, getting a little bit older and more aware at this point as he sees things going crazy with his brothers. You know, his sister gets raped, and, you know, that's got to be insane. But then his brother's angry and going and killing the men of Shechem, and, you know, and then Jacob being stressed out about that, and the men of Shechem are going to look at us, and we're going to be a stink in their nostrils, and we have to get out of here. And poor little Joseph, you know, I mean, he's probably a young teen or preteen at that time, you know, moving along, and as they're heading from that place to get back to Bethel, his mom dies. You know, you think about the stress that would be. You know, his little brother's born and his mom passes away. And so that's stressful. And then, you know, of course, I don't know how well he knew his mother or his grandmother's nurse, but she's passed away right before that. And then Rachel dies, and then they get back home and finally settle with Isaac back in the land. And then Grandpa Isaac, who he just met probably for the first time, then he dies. And so this little guy who's experienced a lot of loss and a lot of trauma in his life, and yet with all that drama and what we're going to see here today, mostly sibling rivalry, he ends up being an exceptional kid. You know, grows up wanting to follow the Lord. And, you know, it just goes back to show you that the choice is you could grow up in a palace and turn out great and love Jesus, or you could grow up in the slums and have a very dysfunctional family and be abused as a child, and the next thing you know, you're somebody God is using mightily. It doesn't really matter who you are, where you've been, or what's happened in your life. You know, if you are willing to have a heart towards the Lord and willing to humble yourself and give yourself to the Lord, it doesn't matter what you've done or where you've been. Jesus can forgive you, and he can make your life something beautiful. And so here we're going to see just some real dysfunction. I'm used to dysfunction. I have a very dysfunctional family by choice. You know, we take in foster kids, and it's insane at times, you know. Sometimes our kids love each other on rare glimpses. You see that. Other times, I hate you. You can never play with my toys ever again, ever. You know, I've heard that a couple of times. Of course, that's all idle threats, because the next thing you know, they're playing with each other again, and everything's okay. And I joke with them, I thought you said never again. You're never going to play with him again. Well, I was just really mad, you know. But, you know, here we see something of dysfunction that leads to, you know, and I've heard my kids threaten to kill each other. I'm going to kill you, you know, while you sleep, or something like that. But, of course, they would never do that. But here's in this chapter, we're going to see something a lot deeper than that. And so in verse 1, it says, Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. And it's interesting because it says his father was a stranger, and, you know, of course, Isaac was born in the land of Canaan and grew up his entire life there, so why is he a stranger? Well, the Hebrew word doesn't really mean stranger in the sense that we would think of it, but it means basically a pilgrim or a sojourner. And of course, they lived in tents, right? These guys didn't camp, didn't build a house. They camped everywhere they went, moving from place to place. And so, in a sense, I guess you could call him a stranger. That is a little strange, you know, living in a tent your whole life. But that was just their vibe. In fact, it says in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 and 9, it says, By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. So Abraham did go to the land of Canaan, and he was a stranger, right? I mean, he's from Ur the Chaldees. He ends up in a place completely foreign to him. And yet, God would multiply him there, give him much wealth, and then, of course, he would have his son Isaac, Ishmael and Isaac, and then Isaac would kind of carry on the tradition, and then Isaac would have Esau and Jacob. And it was to be on Jacob who would carry on the tradition. But it says in verse 9 of Hebrews 11, By faith he dwelt in the land of promise as a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob and the heirs with him of the same promise. And so, you know, this promise is given to Abraham. Abraham passes that on to Isaac. Isaac hoping greatly that Esau is going to be the heir, the next heir. But of course, remember when Rebekah was pregnant, and she was like, man, there is something going on. There's something wrong. And she says to Isaac, you know, if all is well, why am I thus? And he's like, I don't know. So she inquired of the Lord, and the Lord spoke to her very clearly. There's two nations inside of you. They're warring against each other, and you know, the older shall serve the younger. Now, that was the benefit of Rebekah. Rebekah had this promise from the Lord, and yet your promise from the Lord doesn't necessarily translate over or is easily believed by someone else, right? And so Isaac didn't have the benefit of that promise that Rebekah had. And so she knew Jacob was to be the heir of the promise. But, of course, Isaac wanted it to be Esau. And you remember the story, the whole deception with the goat hair on his hands and on the back of his neck, and the smell of the field on his clothes as he put on Esau's clothes. And he went near to Isaac, who was blind, speaking to him in the voice of Jacob, but claiming to be Esau. And Isaac blessed him and gave him the blessing, but also previous to that, Esau had sold the birthright to him for a bowl of soup. And so fulfilling the prophecy, fulfilling what God had told Rebekah, and now Jacob has multiplied and been brought back into the land. And finally, in obedience, you know, we kind of saw him kind of go in and out. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree with these guys, right? You know, I mean, you look at Isaac and his foibles going down in the wrong direction, and God correcting him, bringing him back to the land of Canaan. Abraham, you know, leave your country and your family and go to the place your father's house, and go to the place I show you. And so what does he do? He brings his father's house with him, until finally his father dies, and then he brings his family, Lot, with him, until Lot finally goes to the other side, and then finally Abraham's in obedience. And so we see this pattern throughout their lives, this disobedience and then coming into a place of compliance and obedience to God. And maybe you see that in your own life as well. Times of disobedience, and I'm not really sure I want all that God has for me. I kind of have this idea that things are going to be better over here. But then, as we find the blessings come as we move closer to the will of God. And so Jacob, dwelling finally in the land where his father ordained him by God, and it was a place where he was supposed to be. So finally back in the center of God's will. And it says, verse 2, this is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. So Joseph, being a little bit of a tattletale, I guess you could say, but he sees his brothers doing the wrong thing, And I don't know about you, but having 5 kids in the house, I am sick and tired of tattling. It drives me crazy. We almost give the same punishment to the kid who tattles as the kid who did the wrong. I say, if you guys want to be in trouble, come in and tattle. If you work it out, unless somebody's bleeding or dying, I don't want to be told, kind of get to that point. But, it doesn't say. He brings in an evil report. His brothers have done something. It doesn't tell us what, but he comes in and tells his dad. And the problem with that is that, of course, Dad probably had some consequences or was disappointed with his other sons, but it makes Joseph to be kind of despised. It kind of begins this resentment that they have towards their brother. And so it says, verse 3, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made him a tunic of many colors. And so he's Daddy's favorite. And that's understandable. You have these sons who have been pretty rotten. We just hear about the sons of Zilpah and Bilhah, and they're out in the field doing things they're not supposed to be doing. But then you remember that Simeon and Levi, as they were angry about what happened to their sister Dinah, they went and killed the men of Shechem and embarrassed their father. It was an atrocious thing to do after making a covenant with them to kill the entire group of men. And it would seem that all the sons, not just them, but all the older sons went and plundered the land of Shechem, took the women away and took the children away. And so not a good scene. And then, of course, you remember that Reuben, his oldest, and a lot of times the oldest will be the favorite of fathers in the Bible. And yet the oldest went into Bilhah, his father's wife. And, it was a disgrace in Israel. It's not something that they're supposed to do. And so, he has disappointment for his oldest son, Reuben. And so, all these problems going on. And then his favorite wife, I think every man should have a favorite wife. I have a favorite wife. I only have one wife, but that should be your favorite, right? Your one wife should be your favorite. But it's really sad that he has to have a favorite wife. But his favorite wife, Rachel, the one that he loved, the only one he ever wanted, and that's the really sad thing about this, is the only one he ever really wanted, she's the one who passes away, but she bears to him the firstborn child of his favorite, the love of his life. And so, of course, this boy's going to be special to him, especially after the passing of Rachel. I can imagine he found great comfort in his relationship with Joseph after his wife died. And so, the other boy's still a baby. Men don't have much to do with babies. Until they're about 2, when they can start playing and go out and help you mend a fence, they're not much good. You don't have the equipment to make them happy. You hold them sometimes, you change some bums, but most of all they just want mom until they're old enough to do something, to do something with dad. And so, Benjamin's still just a baby, and now his 17-year-old boy, he's the one he's kind of dumping his life into. He's the one who's bringing him comfort from all the loss that he's experienced. And so he kind of makes him a favorite. And this is not a good thing. It's hard, and I know the dynamics of having kids that you love more than other kids, and that sounds awful, but when you have foster kids and when you have adopted kids, it's like babysitting somebody else's kids. You don't have the same attachment, and attachment takes time. And so, you bring a child into your home, and, foster parents understand this. You don't understand this until you adopt or you foster, but it takes years sometimes to build a proper attachment to where you actually feel like this is my kid. And so that's a difficult thing, because even in that, you want to treat all your kids equal and with equal love and with fairness, right? And yet, I don't know if you've ever had somebody else's kid sneeze on you, and you're just like, take care of your kid. You feel the same. You feel the same with a child that isn't yours biologically until you've attached to them. And so there's difficulty there, and there's struggle within your heart to attach and to have that bond, and there's things you can do to help that along. But, I can understand how, you can at times love one child more than another, and yet as a good parent, you have to treat them all with equal love. You have to act out in love towards them even though you don't feel it, right? And that's definitely not happening in this relationship. You have Joseph, who is being treated more kindly, and not only just being treated more kindly by his father, but given a princely robe. And the idea of this coat of many colors, and there's debate as to what this really means, but the idea, it would seem, that this is a coat that was probably it was woven of one fabric, and so there wasn't any seams in it, and it had sleeves and went all the way to the ground. Whereas a regular worker's cloak would be sleeveless because you're working, right? And, short so you can run. And so what he's given him is kind of a supervisor's cloak. And so you can see Joseph out there with the clipboard. Like, okay, well, Zilpah's child. Simeon's not so good. Okay, we're going to write that down. And he's just kind of given this privilege of you're better than your brothers. And he's given, this is probably a cloak that should have been given to Reuben. Of course, Reuben blew that when he tried to do a power play and slept with his dad's wife. So just kind of a highly dysfunctional family, as you can see already. But when his brothers saw, verse 4, when his brothers saw their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. And so the family dynamics of favoritism. And that's what happens when one child is favored over another. It increases the rivalry, and it breeds that hatred, and it's just unfair in their minds, and they can't reconcile it. And so Joseph becomes the target of disdain for his brothers. You see, that's the problem. Whenever we take one child and we say, I love this child more than another child, or treat one child better because maybe that child's more obedient, and treat the other one with, more discipline or more whatever because they're naughty or whatever. And you have this inequity in the way in the love that you're giving to your children. Even though it may be a blessing to the one child to have more of your love, the other children now are going to treat that child poorly because they see the inequity of it. And so, there's nothing good about it. It needs to be something within a family where there's equity. Verse 5, it says, now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. And 17 years old, that's all I have to say. 17-year-old boys don't have a lot of discretion. And he should have had the dream and thought, you know what, this is probably not okay to share. But maybe thinking himself better than them. Maybe, look, I have the princely robe. Dad treats me better than you guys. Someday you guys are all going to bow down to me. I'm going to be the master. You guys are going to be the slaves. And that's how he sees himself. And so he tells them this dream, which was probably bad form. But verse 6, it says, so he said to them, please hear this dream which I have dreamed. So he's making a proclamation. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And so this is a significant dream. Why sheaves in a field? Well, we're going to see later on as we go through the narrative of Joseph's life that there's going to come a day when grain is scarce within the land of Egypt as well as the whole land of Canaan. And everyone's going to go down to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph. And so he's going to be carrying, stockpiling these sheaves of wheat. And so when his brothers come, they're going to bow down to him to get wheat. And that's going to be very significant. Now, it seems super inappropriate for him to tell them this dream. And yet the significance of him telling them this dream is going to have great weight. And so no doubt by the Holy Spirit, even though it's indiscreet, and even though it's maybe boastful, by the Holy Spirit, preparing his brothers so when they find themselves in Egypt bowing down to Joseph, they'll remember this. You know what? We didn't believe him. We didn't want to believe him. And yet here we are. But you know what's amazing, and this is what I really love about this story, and I think we all love the story of Joseph, is that when the whole thing plays out and Joseph is there, and it's obvious that he has been mistreated by his brethren, he forgives them. He sees, and I think that that's a spiritual gift that, that God gives us of forgiveness, of grace, but he sees God's hand in the whole thing. And this is always his perspective. This is Joseph's perspective. And God would that we would all have that perspective when we see things happening in our lives that we don't understand, when we see things, bad things happening to us, maybe the unthinkable happens, and yet Joseph, through all of the negative, all of the trials he went through, he would always be faithful to the Lord. He would never, it never tells us he would anyway. He would never question the Lord. At least it doesn't record that he did. And he would always honor the Lord. I mean, you would think that Joseph, when tempted, would say, you know what? God hasn't been good to me. I'm not going to be faithful to him. But rather, he says stuff like, how could I sin against God and do this great wickedness? He could have said to himself, I deserve this. God hasn't been with me. God hasn't treated me fairly. I tried to be a good kid, and I ended up getting wronged. Never once that's recorded did Joseph ever do that. And so he tells them this dream, and it would come to fulfillment, and they would bow down to him. Now, I think that it's important and to realize that sometimes God gives you things to share with people that will be significant in their life. And one of the things that's happened for us, my wife and I, and most of you know this story, but my wife and I were barren for years and couldn't have children. And we've been tested. The doctors say you guys can't have children still. But we prayed and asked God to show us specifically we'd have a child, and we went to a retreat, and God spoke to us through another person saying, you're going to have a baby, So when we had prayed specifically, apart from each other, it's a long story, I won't tell the whole thing, but basically we believed it. When God spoke that through that person, because we had both prayed independently of each other, not even knowing the other had prayed, when God spoke that to us through Cindy DeVille from Calvary Chapel Hagerman, we knew it was from the Lord. And so never having been pregnant, with no sign that we were ever going to get pregnant, we decided it was a good idea to tell all of her unbelieving family and all of my family, believing family, which, to them, a lot of them don't believe that the Lord works that way anymore. So it was kind of a thing that we just felt very strongly we needed to tell them. And they felt sorry for us, honestly. They felt sorry for us because we would believe that, and poor Mike and Shannon, they've tried so hard to have kids, and they're so desperate to have kids that they're making up stories now. And so, of course, as the Lord gave Shannon another prophecy through another lady at a pastor's wife's conference, and then it was basically, the Lord knows you've been waiting a year. He's going to give you a child very soon. So we waited a whole year, believing the whole time, never doubting. And then a lady she'd never met before, in a prayer portion of the thing, said, the Lord knows you've been waiting a year. He's going to give you a child very soon. And then another lady, Cindy, said, was it Cindy Lou? Cindy Lou said, the Lord's healing your womb as we speak. And a month to the day later, we conceived. And we had our son, Isaiah. And so what a witness, what a testimony. And the same thing here. God confirms, And so sometimes it's good to share those things. The Lord's speaking to you, and God confirms it. So he tells them, and maybe he felt like the Lord was telling him to tell them. It says, verse 8, and his brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now, verse 39 is the second punch. Then he dreamed still another dream, and told it to his brothers and said, look, I have dreamed another dream. And this time, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowed down to me. Now, it doesn't tell us that he knew what the dream meant. It's possible that he did, but he just had this dream. These celestial bodies are now bowing down to me. Man, something good must be happening, be coming. And so he says, the moon and the stars, 11 stars bowed down to me. So he told his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him. And so it ends up being Jacob who interprets the dream, and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I, your brothers, indeed come and bow down to the earth before you? And so, of course, his mother, meaning probably Leah, who would, kind of take over mothering now that Rachel is dead. But it's a significant dream for a few reasons. It shows the order of the dream, because that when Joseph is in Egypt and his brothers come to bow down, it's them first, right? They come and bow down to him for the wheat. And then later, his whole family will come, and his whole family will bow down before him because he's a dignitary, not because they want wheat from him. And so it's interesting, the order of the dreams and how they're fulfilled. But now, to Joseph's credit, he's giving this dream, not necessarily knowing what it means, but now it's going to become super significant and significant to us. It's amazing as you read through the Bible how the Bible kind of ties together. And if you pay attention, you'll notice things in other places that will kind of shed light. Now, the book of Revelation is kind of a fascinating book, because you have a book that is written by John in 90 A.D. He's an old man, exiled to the island of Patmos, and he writes this book that has, and this is what's fascinating, most people don't know this, 700 references to the Old Testament. It's pretty amazing. As you go through, just about every verse in the book of Revelation has some allusion or reference back to the Old Testament. And this is one of those places. So in Revelation chapter 12, you want to turn over there just so you can see it for yourself. John is given a vision. He's given a sign. He sees a great sign in heaven. And it's amazing, you read the commentaries, to see how many people come with an interpretation to this passage, and yet here it is in Genesis chapter 37. It says, in Revelation chapter 12, starting in verse 1, now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his head. His tail drew a third of the stars from heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. So, the question is, who is this woman? Well, we find out in Genesis chapter 37 that the sun is Israel, that the moon is Leah, and that the 12 stars are the 12 tribes of Israel. And so this woman represents the nation of Israel who gives birth to a male child. Who is that male child? Anybody? It's Jesus, yeah. The dragon tried to devour him the second he was born. Remember, Jesus was born, and then they killed the innocents in Bethlehem. And, Satan trying to wipe him out. And then, of course, it goes all the way. And this is a vision. John, as he sees this vision, he's seeing a sign in heaven. It's not like something literal, but he's seeing this sign. It's representative of the nation of Israel bringing birth to the Messiah who would be born. Satan would try to devour him, bruise his heel, if you will. And then he would one day rule the nations with a rod of iron. That's Jesus' legacy. That's what he's going to do in the future. And so, if we pay attention as we read the Old Testament, it will really help us when we get to the New Testament and we look at these prophecies and things, because you'll read a lot of commentaries and people will say, well, the woman is the church. Well, that's a problem because the woman's supposed to be a chaste virgin, presented to Christ, not pregnant, bearing a child, right? So we see this amazing picture of the nation of Israel. And so Joseph's dream is not just significant in that Jacob understood what it was, but it's significant to us, as we look at the book of Revelation and we interpret the things that are to come. And so, verse 11, it says, "And his brothers envied him, but his father kept this matter in mind." And it's not a good recipe for family love. A father who's favoring a child who's from a different mother than the other children. And of course, that's, part of it, And maybe you've had that. I've been in that place as a child myself where I've had a stepdad and a stepmom, and that dynamic can be really dicey, because just like being a foster parent, when you're a step-parent, a lot of times you love your kids in the family more than you love your spouse's kids, and that can cause some problems. And so tricky family dynamics with the three left wives and Joseph being the only one old enough to matter, Benjamin still being a baby at the time, and his father's other wives' children despising him. And even though his father rebukes him here, notice he keeps the matter in his heart. It reminds me of Mary. When the angel comes to her and says, "Hey, you're going to have a baby," and she's like, "What could these?" She pondered it. What could these things mean? What in the world's going on here? And that's kind of what, even though he rebukes him, which was proper, okay, because he knows this is hubris. Maybe this is out of line for the youngest child to be telling all the rest of the family, "Hey, guys, someday you're all going to bow down to me." Not flying so well. And he rebukes him, which would be proper, but he also thinks, I wonder if there's something to this. I wonder if there's a reason. And I often myself wonder, it seems, starting with our first child, a miracle, and they call, what my wife has, they call a biblical womb, because you see that with Sarah, you see that with Rebecca, you see that with Hannah, where a woman's barren, and then she has a son, miraculously, but then those stories always start out like that, and then the child ends up being somebody like Moses or something, right? It's like, and I wonder to myself sometimes, and not just our oldest son Isaiah, but our other children, and how it's almost as though the enemy tried to snatch them away from us. I was telling Shannon the other day, I was like, we've had an ant problem. In that it seems like every time we're told we're going to be able to adopt some children, we've chosen you guys to adopt these children. We get excited, and then an aunt shows up. I want them, and it's never a good situation. So I tell her, we have an aunt problem. But an aunt shows up, ends up swooping in, taking the kids the first time, and realizing I can't do this, and the kids end up coming back to us. This time as well, we had an aunt who was like, I'll take the kids, but then we prayed about it, and she just never contacted the department. So, it's just one of those things. It's the Lord's working our aunt problems out. He has aunt traps, but you just never know. We end up getting with these kids, and we know, we prayed, and we know that these kids are in our lives for a reason. Why would God take these kids and put them in our family? And we prayed specifically, and God answered those prayers specifically. And so I kind of wonder sometimes, who am I raising? And I think that we should think that with our kids. Not just, I got to raise these kids and make sure they make it to 18 without killing themselves or committing mass genocide somewhere. Or, we got to think in terms of, who has God put in my trust? Because, you don't have to have a biblical womb to have a prophet in your family, right? To a kid who's going to rise up and become something amazing for the Lord. There's no guarantee that even our kids will become something amazing for the Lord, but I always have to think that way, that God's put them in my family for a reason, and that there's got to be something that God is going to do with these kids' lives. And so to prepare them for that, I guess, in some way, or to pray for them for that in some way. Not that you could prepare. And I try not to put that burden on them. I would never say, God has something special for you. You're going to be great. I would never do that to them. I don't want them to have to live up to some ideal that I put in their mind. But you wonder, who am I raising? Am I raising the next Moses, or am I raising the next Elijah? Or am I raising, We all don't want to be raising the next Judas, that's for sure. But, to realize that these children that we've been given are an inheritance from the Lord, and that, I need to be praying for them, at least, that God might use their life for in some way. In verse 12 it says, then his brothers went to feed their flock in Shechem. And here's guys going back to the scene of the crime. And I have to wonder to myself, why are they going back to Shechem? Remember, Shechem was the place. Shechem was the guy who raped Dinah, their sister, and they killed all the men of Shechem. So why are they going back there? And you have to wonder. I can imagine this giving poor Jacob, a little bit of anxiety. Why are my kids wanting to go back to that place? I was worried that we weren't even going to make it out of there alive, that the nations around us would come and seek vengeance because of what we did in Shechem. And now they want to go back there. It's almost like they're testing fate. Is God really, I don't know. I don't know what they thought, but they went back there. And I'm guessing Israel or Jacob was kind of concerned. It says, verse 13, and Israel, which is also Jacob, said to Joseph, are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. So he said to him, here I am. Then he said to him, please go and see if it is well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me. So he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. And so Jacob, or Israel, being concerned, maybe not hearing things back, he's left several voice messages. At least seven text messages. I was thinking about this, and what kind of anxiety would we, if we were forced back into that? I remember, like, my mom trying to call my dad's work, and, my dad not being there, and she was worried, like, how can I get a hold of him? It's like, no way to. The best you can do is sit by this phone that's attached to the wall and try to keep calling people, but there's no answering, no voicemail or anything like that, so it just rings and rings and rings. We live in a different world, don't we? It's crazy. We can just send a text message, hey, everything okay? I'll be home in 5 minutes. You know, I mean, we don't even say that. We just type in letters, and everybody knows what that means. You know, BRB 30. You know, and that's be right back, 30 minutes. You know, you just know. You know, today, but back then, man, you know, to get a message, okay, I'm going to send my 17-year-old son 30 miles away through dangerous country to find his brothers who I'm worried about. And now, can you imagine the level of anxiety people had in those days? Send him out there. He's going to go find his brothers. It's going to take him several days to get back to me to even tell me if everything's okay. You know, I remember reading, we've been reading for the last 10 years. We've been reading Beyond or To the Golden Shore with Adoniram Judson. And we read until another wife dies, and Shannon's like, I can't read this. And we wait, and then after a while, we'll read a few more chapters, and then somebody else dies. But this last section we read, I remember reading, he got a telegram from somebody saying the funeral was nice, and he's like, who died? And then a couple days later, the first telegram got to him, and it was like, your wife is sick. and then the second telegram came, and it's like, she died, and then the baby died. And like he gets the funeral was nice first. I mean, can you imagine that? And that was a month before that all these telegrams started coming, you know, and he had no idea. Can you imagine living in a world like that? We're blessed in ways, and it's a curse and a blessing at the same time, isn't it? But, you know, here he is sending his 17-year-old son out to find their brothers in Shechem, in a place where the people of the neighboring towns could have seen him and said, let's just kill those guys. And he's sending his son to go check it out. Anyway, sends him out there from Hebron. And it says, verse 15, now a certain man found him, and there he was wandering in the field, and the man asked him, saying, what are you seeking? So he said, I am seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they are feeding their flocks. And so we don't know who this man is. It's just a mysterious man. Happened to be there, happened to know who his brothers were, and happened to be able to send him in the right direction. It says, and the man said, verse 17, they have departed from here. I heard from them saying, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. And so he goes 30 miles to Shechem. Then he goes another 15 miles a different direction to Dothan. It means two cisterns is the name of that place. And according to the commentaries, and I don't know anything about it, but the commentaries say that this was the best place to feed flocks during that time. So that's probably why they're going there, just more grass, more luscious grass to feed their flocks. Verse 18, now when they saw him far off, even before he came near, they conspired against him to kill him. So this is pretty serious. Here are his 11 brothers, or excuse me, not 11 brothers, it was his 10 brothers. Benjamin's not with them, of course. His 10 brothers, they see him coming, and their first thought is, hey, we're far away from home, let's whack the guy. Let's do away with him. It's our opportunity to be done with this. Then, verse 19, they said to one another, look, this dreamer is coming. And so it's the dreams that were kind of the straw that broke the camel's back that made them realize, we're not going to put up with any of his dreams. Let's see how his dreams come true if we kill him. And so they're bitter against him to the point of murder. Verse 20, come therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit, and we shall say some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams. Now I want you I just want to pause here, and I just want to remind you that these are God's chosen people. Isn't that wild to think about? This is God's chosen nation. These 10 guys, plus Joseph and his brother, are the ones who are destined to bring the Messiah into the world, destined to bring us the Word of God, destined to become a great nation through whom all the nations of the world will be blessed. Isn't that wild? And here they are, murderous, evil, wicked. To me, as awful as they are, it's just a testimony of God's grace upon us. That God is so gracious that he would take these guys and he would turn them into a great nation. And a lot of them would repent, and they're going to make some decisions now in their youth and their stupidity, and we do a lot of dumb things in our youth sometimes. Not everybody. Joseph doesn't, but these guys do. And he's going to take their mistakes and he's going to turn them around and he's going to bring redemption at the end of their lives. But it's difficult to watch your kids go through mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake, and to pray for them and say, God, is this going to ever change? We hold to those promises of the Word of God that he's faithful. We cling to to Solomon's words that, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. And you're like, when does he get old? When is he going to be old finally? So he's going to turn back. It's so hard sometimes. But these guys, in their youthful bitterness and zeal, are murderous towards their brother. And yet God would use it. It says, verse 21, but Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, let us not kill him. Then Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into the pit which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hand and bring him back to his father. Now, there's a couple of things at play here. You remember Reuben, first of all, has already kind of disgraced himself before his father. His father's probably showing great disgust towards Reuben. And so he's probably thinking, I don't want to be the one in charge when it comes out that we killed our brother, because he's the oldest and he's going to be held responsible. There's that, but there's also possibly another motive for Reuben wanting to do this, and that could be that Reuben sees an opportunity to be restored in the eyes of his father. His brothers try to kill him, throw him into a pit. Reuben comes back, saves the day, grabs him. I didn't want to kill him, Dad. These guys are all evil. I was good. Here you go, Dad. Here's your favorite son. Okay, Reuben, I forgive you. And maybe that's what his motives were. It's hard to say, but Reuben is the only one pushing against this idea of just killing him. Verse 23, so it came to pass when Joseph had come to his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. And this had to be terrifying for Joseph. His brothers who he thought were on his side, maybe. Obviously wasn't afraid to go look for them in the field. Now attack him. And this has to be devastating. In many ways it becomes part of that type of Christ, which you're going to see in Joseph's life. Clothed by his father, loved by his father, and then hated by his brethren. It says in John chapter 1 that he came to his own, and his own received him not. And that's how Jesus was. He was despised and rejected by his brethren. And so was Joseph, thrown into a pit, of course, sold off. And Jesus, of course, would be sold off by his brethren as well in terms of the Jewish people. And so it says they grab him, tear off his tunic. Verse 24, they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. So probably a cistern, meaning the kind of an underground storage tank that they would dig out in clay areas so that they could store water. Verse 25, and the place is called Dothan, which means two cisterns, so it's probably what it's talking about. Verse 25, and they sat down to eat a meal. Then they lifted up their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing spices, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry them down to Egypt. And so they throw him into a pit. They're thinking about how we're going to kill him, and they just decide, let's sit down and eat lunch. These guys are sick. There's no remorse, no like, what are we doing? Are we going to really do it? No, hey, you guys want a snack? Let's everybody eat. So they're sitting down eating lunch, and then they see these Ishmaelites coming. And they know that not only are the Ishmaelites good for selling myrrh and bearing spices and balm, but also they're good for some human trafficking too. And so if they can sell their brother to him, it says in verse 26, so Judah, said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hands be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers listened. Oh, come on, he's our brother. Let's not kill him. Let's sell him. Get some cash off the side, Let's not have the guilt of his blood on our hands. Let's just sell him and have some cash in our pockets instead. You know what is interesting is this is the guy through whom Jesus is going to come. Judah. Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Now, you think Judah's bad here, wait till chapter 38. It's NC-17. It's pretty bad. We see Judah just really making some really bad decisions. And it's a mess, so you have to read ahead. But here we have this big problem. Judah comes up with a solution. Let's not kill him, we'll sell him. And it says, so his brothers listen, verse 28, then the Midianite traders, so Midianites are Ishmaelites, Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Who else was sold for 30 shekels of silver? Jesus, right? So we see these parallels between Joseph and Jesus that are amazing. Sold him off to the Midianites so he could be sold on the slave block in Egypt. And I wonder what Joseph was thinking. What's the purpose in this, God, And I know that a lot of us, if something like this were to happen to us, we're betrayed by our family, we're sold into slavery, which happens today. Not that a lot in America, but it does still happen in America. In some countries it's very common to sell your kids off or to be kidnapped and sold. Colombia is one of the biggest places for that. Kidnapping capital of the world. Kidnap you and sell you into slavery into Mexico or somewhere like that. Or into the drug trade, whatever. And so here's this awful thing that's happened to him, and how is he going to respond to that? Why, God? I'm sure. Why are you allowing this to happen to me? And yet, with all of that, Joseph remaining faithful to the Lord. But this is what's really troubling to me. Turn with me to Psalm 105. Psalm 105 gives us God's perspective of this whole event. And it's very, very chilling when you think about it from God's perspective. Psalm 105, starting in verse 16. It says, moreover, he, God, called for a famine in the land. He destroyed all the provision of bread. He sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They hurt his feet with fetters. He was laid in irons until the time of his words came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him. The king sent and released him, and the rulers of the people let him go free. He made him lord over his house and ruler of all his possessions, to bind his princes at his pleasure, and teach his elders wisdom. And Israel also came to Egypt, and Jacob dwelt in the land of Ham. He didn't eat Ham. That was just the son of Noah that populated Egypt at the time. But isn't that amazing? Isn't that send chills up your spine? All of this. His brothers betray him. They throw him in a pit. They sell him off to the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites take him to Egypt. The Ishmaelites sell them. Everybody's thinking, look what we're doing. We did this to our brother. We bought this slave and we're selling him at a profit. And it simply just says, God called for a famine in the land, and he sent a man. Isn't that wild? He sent a man. And you have to wonder in your own life, okay, things are going crazy in my life. Bad things are happening. Hard times are coming. And we can have a choice. Are we going to become bitter, or are we going to become better? Are we going to say, why are you letting this happen to me? I hate you, God. Or are you going to say, you know what? I believe God has a purpose in this. I believe God allowed this in my life for a reason. Because sometimes we go through things, and I've seen people who have gone through horrible things in their life, and it's those things that sparked that desire in their heart either to come to the Lord or to change their life. But oftentimes it all started with them through that dark time, through that trial, clinging to Jesus. And God knows that sometimes when He will allow difficulty in our lives, that it's going to drive us to Him. And when it drives us to Him and we find out how wonderful He really is, we find ourselves being more effective and more fruitful in our lives than we ever thought possible. And yet it took that dark, deep, dark trial or that deep, dark problem to bring us to that place where we were bendable enough. The alternative is, and we all have that choice, whether you live in luxurious pleasure with a perfect family or whether you've grown up in a slum with a dysfunctional family, it doesn't matter. Everybody has the choice to say, I'm going to take my life and let God use it, or I'm going to despise my life because life isn't satisfying, and I'm going to be angry at God for it. And we all have that choice. And when we choose to cling to God, we choose to take those difficulties and turn them into a catalyst to drive us to Jesus, then we find why God sent those problems in the first place. That He sent them because He wants to refine us and to make us into something great. And He can take a proud young man who has a lot of dreams and thinks a lot of himself and hurt his feet with fetters as he goes to the slave block, and then he ends up going to prison, and turn his life into something beautiful. He humbled and broke him enough to where he was humble and broke enough to stand before the world as second in the kingdom, just as Jesus would be exalted to the right hand of God. So, verse 29, then Reuben returned to the pit. So Reuben wasn't there when they did all this. And indeed Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes, and he returned to his brothers and said, the lad is no more, and where shall I go? So Reuben he's thinking, man, I thought this was going to be an opportunity to redeem myself maybe, or maybe he thought, I'm responsible for their actions since I'm the oldest brother, and now what's going to happen to me? When I get home without my brother, and we're going to see this later when this happens to him again, and Joseph tests him, and he's like, I'm not going to go back without my brother. You take me, because if I go back without my brother, then Dad is going to send me away forever. And so he's pretty upset. And it says, verse 31, so they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not? And so they attempt to cover it up. How often, when we make mistakes, do those mistakes come back to haunt us? Because I remember something to do with a goat and preparing it and putting its skin on his hands and on his neck and covering up himself with the smell of his brother and going and deceiving his father with a goat. And then I remember another time where he woke up thinking that he was with Rachel all night and it was Leah. And now, once again, he's being deceived by his children. It's just like sometimes the past just comes back to haunt you, doesn't it? And so now his kids are trying to pull the same thing on him. Very dirty trick. And he recognized it and said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. without a doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces. Now, they didn't have forensic evidence, and he couldn't test the blood and say, this is not human blood, this is goat's blood. My son is still alive. Not in those days. Nowadays, you wouldn't fool anybody, but those days, he just comes to his own conclusion. And I think of the loss that Jacob has felt. The loss of his wife, the loss of his nurse that raised him, the loss of his mother that he wasn't there for, the loss of his father who had just died not long before, and now the loss of his favorite son. And you have to wonder how that's affecting him. Sometimes God allows us to be reduced to nothing, that we might realize that he's all we need. I love Corrie ten Boom, who said, you never know that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. I can't say that I've experienced that, but I hope I never have to. I hope I just discover that Jesus is all I need before I lose everything, right? Wow. Then Jacob tore his clothes, verse 34, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, for I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning. Thus his father wept for him. It's got to be one of the hardest things that a parent goes through. I just talked to a mom today who lost her daughter not too long ago. And, just to see the pain in her eyes, can't imagine what that would be like to lose your child. Verse 36, now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, the officer of Pharaoh, and the captain of the guard. And then we're going to take an intermission next week as we look at Judah and his sordid mess. Very sordid mess. But that's kind of the end of that section until we pick Joseph up back in Potiphar's house in a couple of weeks. So this coming week, read ahead, verse 38. It is a little bit graphic. I'm not going to lie to you. It's probably one of the most sordid chapters in the Bible, chapter 38. But important because, again, we're going to see Judah and the mess he is being the one who brings about the Messiah into the world. So an important chapter, as graphic and awful as it is. So let's pray.